Thanks, Jim.
There is a statue on the Montana State Capitol lawn, a mounted horseman with saber drawn. And there is a story. But like all history, its timeline is not a flat line. And 150 years later, the story remains alive. Hey, Paddy dear, now did you hear the news that's going round? The shamrock is forbid by law to grow on Irish ground. No more St. Patrick's Day will keep his colour can't be seen. They're hanging men and women for the wearing of the green. Thomas Francis Meagher, not Meagher, was born to a Catholic family August 3rd, 1823 in Waterford, Ireland, under British rule for 700 years, give or take a few months. Meagher's father, also a Thomas, was a well-to-do businessman, the first Catholic mayor of Waterford in over 200 years, and a member of Parliament, and this was significant in light of the penal laws inflicted by Cromwell in the 1640s. Now, young Thomas was sent to Jesuit primary school in England, where the headmaster was determined to cure him of his horrid Irish brogue. Well, this of course set him up for all kinds of pranks against his British headmasters. It also set him on the path to become one of the most celebrated orators and statesmen of his day. He played the clarinet in the school band, but was severely reprimanded for refusing to play any song honoring the British. He won awards for writing and debating, and graduated with honors, speaking 5 languages. Thomas's early acquaintances included the poet Percy Shelley, whose wife Mary wrote Frankenstein. Oh. And he may have romanced one Lady Jane L.G., who wrote poetry under the pen name Speranza. She became Lady Jane Wilde, Oscar Wilde's famous mother. But when Thomas met her, she was already deeply entrenched in the radical Young Ireland movement, which Thomas joined in 1847, just out of college. For 2 years, he spoke fiercely and wrote for Irish freedom. Come all ye young rebels, and list while I say, for the love of one's country is a terrible thing. It banishes fear with the speed of the flame, and makes us all part of the patriot game. Now, some regard Thomas Meagher with admiration, others with disdain. Such individuals, past or present, never escape controversy. And so our story begins. Thomas Francis Meagher, 5'9" tall, blue eyes, brown hair, medium built, yet bigger than life. And now as I lie here, reviewing my roles, I think of those traitors who bargained in souls, and I wish that my rifle had given the same to those who have sold out the patriot game, and I played out my part in the patriot game. The Young Ireland movement preached insurrection against the British Crown, and Meagher became its most vocal spokesman. Now, 1847 in Ireland was very unsettled. Famine ruled the land, also known as the Great Hunger, on Gorta Mór, but the Irish knew it as genocide. And it all started with an inbreeding of the potato stock that caused it to fail. The famine had sent millions of Irish to America or to the grave. Incensed over English landlords' treatment of Irish tenants, Thomas became inflamed when it was learned that while Ireland produced plenty of food, it was being shipped out across the sea for a huge profit, leaving the Irish people to starve. So he went to France and returned with a newly designed Irish tricolor flag inspired by the revolution's red, white, and blue. His tricolor represented green for Catholic and orange for Protestant, with a field of white in between signifying a hoped-for peace between the two warring factions. As he said, "I hope to see one day this flag waving as our national banner. We must now take up the banner with saber, pike, and gun. We must brave the darkest hour, for the battle has just begun. We must fight and take no prisoners in this revolution, as we fight to keep our nation proud and free." Young Ireland also wanted an Irish Parliament separate from the British Parliament. Meagher organized hurling clubs to recruit and train members, but it was a bad time for revolution. Famine took precedence. As he said, "The sword of famine is less sparing than the bayonet of the soldier." Eventually, tired of debate, he delivered with venom and fury the speech of his lifetime. His accent had settled somewhere between classical English, thank you Jesuits, and native Irish, where it remained for the rest of his life. The tense Dublin crowd quieted to the spell of a born eloquent orator. "A strong people alone can build up a great nation. To be strong, people must be self-reliant, self-ruled, self-sustained. Abhor the sword, stigmatize the sword, no. For my lord, it is the right of a nation to govern herself, not in this hall, but upon the ramparts purchased by the effusion of generous blood. In defense or in the assertion of liberty, I hail the sword as a sacred weapon." Ever after, Thomas Francis, just 23 years old, would be known as Meagher of the Sword. The new rebellion was fixed for June 1848. The Irish tricolor flag flew proudly, illegally. There is green in the flag to honor Ireland's verdant fields, and the white for the virtue of our fathers' high ideals. But the orange is like the color of the brave young blood that spilled in our fight to make this nation unite every nation. In our fight to keep this nation proud and free. Proud and free. The revolt was doomed by bad planning and fate. Two factors that would haunt Meagher for the rest of his life. He was impetuous and passionate, a dangerous combination. And after several miscues, the rebels were arrested and tried for treason against the crown. When the judge asked, "So, Mr. Meagher, what have you to say in your defense?" his reply was lengthy and customarily eloquent, yet most remember only one part. "My lord, this is not our first offense, nor will it be our last. If spared, sure will not be so foolish to be caught again." The judge was not amused. Meagher and the others were sentenced to death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Apparently the British wanted to take no chances. Another of his most famous speeches followed, that called "From the Dock." "I know this crime entails the penalty of death, but the history of Ireland explains that crime and justifies it. Judged by that history, the treason of which I stand convicted loses all guilt, sanctified as a duty, ennobled as a sacrifice." Queen Victoria apparently agreed with that last part. And maybe the judges were moved. Maybe they just didn't want another martyr to rally the cause. And more likely, his important father pulled strings. Regardless, the sentence was commuted to life transportation to Van Diemen's Land off the coast of Australia. He boarded the Swift and set sail. swift. It took 3.5 months to get there. He would never see Ireland again. And as we wallop around Cape Horn, heave away, haul away, you wish to God you'd never been born. We're bound for South Australia. Haul away, rolling king, heave away, haul away, oh hear me sing. We're bound for South Australia, bound for South Australia. The population of Van Diemen's Land at that time was about 65,000. Over half were prisoners. Because Meagher and the others were political crimes, they weren't treated as common criminals, but as ticket of leave prisoners. This means that they could move around pretty freely as long as they checked in regularly. But as political prisoners, terms were conditional, subject to additional rules. They had to give their word not to try to escape. They couldn't leave the district allotted to them, nor leave their house after 10 p.m. Wow. They had to appear once a month in person before the magistrate, and they could not communicate nor live within 30 miles of their fellow conspirators. There were 10 altogether that joined him down there. So Meagher settled in Hobart on Lake Sorrel, and he built a little boat, and he called it Speranza. Remember her? Now, it's not known for sure, but this could have been the same girl who suddenly sent all of his letters back that Christmas, asking him to either send back or burn all of hers. Heartsick, the news rekindled thoughts of rebellion in Meagher. From the mast of his little boat, proudly waved the Irish tricolor, topped by the stars and stripes of America. And then one day he stopped to help a broken down carriage in the road, and in it was Catherine Bennett, governess to a prominent doctor's children. They started seeing one another, and they were married in February of 1851, an unlikely couple, according to many. And even with his new life, Meagher was becoming more and more restless. And it's home, boys, home. Home I'd like to be, home for a while in the old country, where the oak and the ash and the bonny rowan tree are all growing greener in the old country, where the oak and the ash and the bonny rowan tree are all growing greener in the old country. In early 1852, he made arrangements to escape. And you could do it in those days if you wrote a letter to the authorities and told them that's what you wanted to do. It was all about honor. See? So the next day, the police arrived to arrest him at his home just after twilight. With his horse tied just inside the woods, he yelled at them, showed himself briefly, and then leaped aboard his horse, rode like the wind just as the police opened fire, narrowly missing him. He rode all night, changing clothes at some friend's house. He finally made it to a prearranged spot where some fishermen rowed him out to an island off the coast to wait for a passing ship. But the ship was late, and the fishermen left him there, cold and wet and hungry for 10 days, until the ship finally arrived. He boarded it to find that its crew was made up of pirates. But the captain was sympathetic, and they swapped poetry and Shakespeare for the rest of the journey. Now, Thomas Francis Meagher was one of the few to ever escape Van Diemen's Land. His wife stayed behind with her parents, and a month later she had a baby boy who soon died. By the time he got to New York by way of South America, the other conspirators had been pardoned. Oddly, many went on to attain high positions with the governments of Ireland, Australia, Canada, and 2 became celebrated generals in the American Civil War. Had he not escaped, Meagher may have been granted the same, and yet, as much as he longed for freedom, he hated the thought of receiving anything from the British Crown. even a rescinded sentence. Such is the code of honor. And as a side note, the penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, started in 1812, was abandoned in May of 1853, just 14 months after his escape. Its name was changed to Tasmania. With a good case of pistols all in his right hand, like Hector so bold, young Mar did stand. Is it me that you want? Young Mar did cry. Now go try your best for your skill 85. Young Mar, that moment he bid them goodbye. To his horse he gave spurs and he opened their eyes. From Van Diemen's Land then he gave them leg bail, and he went to New York on the back of a whale. That was the first of many songs about the life and deeds of Thomas Francis Meagher. The good case of pistols, of course, is artistic license on the part of the anonymous poet. We're still checking into the back of the whale theory. I think it was a boat. Now, New York was about 20% Irish at that time, and they greeted Thomas with a hero's welcome, which he ceremoniously declined in deference to his fellow conspirators, whom he did not know yet at that point had been pardoned. The New York Fall Lecture Circuit featured Thomas Francis Meagher, and people danced to the T.F. Meagher polka. Sadly, no sheet music for this piece of music exists, or else we'd all be up dancing right now. Now, Meagher's wife, Catherine, joined him early the next year, but any happiness the couple had enjoyed at Lake Sorel was not rekindled in New York. She was socially out of place, and Meagher, to his discredit, did not include her in many of his affairs. And finally, after 4 tense, quarrelsome months, Catherine, again with child, returned to Ireland. Weakened and ill, she died after the birth of their second son, Thomas Bennett. But Thomas thought it best if the child remain in Ireland under the care of his father and his aunt, and planned to return to take care of him later. But 18 months after Catherine's death, Meagher met Elizabeth Townsend. Now, her grandfather had founded the Townsend Iron Works, and he had forged a chain during the Revolutionary War to stretch across the Hudson River to keep the British from entering the harbor. And maybe this resonated with Meagher, you know, anything to thwart the British. They were married in November of 1855 against her father's advice. He promptly wrote her out of his will. But he eventually softened a bit as Thomas made a good living as a lecturer, a newspaperman, and a lawyer. And each of them, bride and groom, made quite a sacrifice to live with each other. Meagher became an American citizen, and Catherine converted to the Catholic faith. He and Elizabeth spent over a year in Panama, hoping to create a railroad across the isthmus, but the deal fell through when the Senate failed to ratify funds. And he saw the Indians of South America in the same light as repressed Irish peasants. And this view would return to him for inspiration some years later. In early 1861, Meagher's legal reputation peaked in the celebrity trial of the day. Philip Key, the U.S. Attorney General and grandson of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the national anthem, had an affair with a congressman's wife that led to a crime of passion, and Key was killed. Meagher's defendant got off. The first case in U.S. legal history to use temporary insanity as a successful plea. He's had a good workout ever since. He seemed destined for greatness, but for the fact of a noted fondness for alcohol. And if I get drunk, well, the money's me own, and them don't like me can leave me alone. I'll tune me fiddle and I'll rosin me bow, and I'll be welcome wherever I go. Tooraloo, 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 tooraloo. I'll tune me fiddle and I'll rosin me bow, and I'll be welcome wherever I go. American Civil War, Meagher felt that Irish immigrants were worse off than the slaves in the South. In fact, he was empathetic to the black man's plight. He saw the coming conflict as an opportunity to train Irish troops under fire and return with a battle-hardened militia to eject the British. And most of the Irish Americans at that time thought, sure, why not? Finally, he decided that fighting for the Union would increase his chances of victory. You see, most people thought that the Civil War was a minor police action that would be over in a couple of weeks. He joined the 69th New York Militia shortly after the firing on Fort Sumter, and his command of the Irish Brigade became the stuff of legend. Meagher praised his newly formed brigade of rough Irish volunteers. If only 1 in 10 come back when this war is over, the military experience will be of more service than would the entire 10 as they are now. He modeled his troops after Algerian zouaves with their flashy red shirts, the firemen of the Irish Brigade. In the hottest of the fire, they rode along the line. A captain of the zouave band crying, now boys, is your time. Ah, who so boldly rides, the bold and dauntless men? 'Tis Thomas Francis Meagher of old Erin's Isle of Green. At first Bull Run, Thomas Meagher was said to have showed coolness and courage, endearing his men to him with the call, now's your time, boys! Raise the colors and follow me! But Bull Run was a disaster. Most of his Irish were killed. They accused General Sherman of bias against the Irish for failure to issue enough supplies, feeling that the Irish were used as expendable cannon fodder. Being overpowered by numbers, our troops were forced to flee. The Southern Black Horse Cavalry on them charged furiously. But in that hour of peril, the flying mast to screen, stood the gallant New York firemen and the boys that wore the green. General Meagher petitioned President Lincoln to let him go home and recruit more Irish. Lincoln was so impressed with his efforts that the two became fast friends. Meagher's appointment to Brigadier General put him in the company of elite Irish Union generals Corcoran, Farnham, Nugent, McClellan. But the Irish were decimated. The 1 in 10 that he had mentioned earlier was becoming horribly true. As one reporter wrote, when anything absurd or desperate is attempted, the Irish Brigade is called upon. Of the original 3,000 or so Irish Brigade members, just over 300 were left. Farewell, Magellan's countrymen who fell that fatal day. Farewell, my gallant countrymen, now mouldering in the clay. Yet blooms the leafy shamrock, yet runs the old machine. Your deeds will live, bold red shirts and the boys that wore the green. Now, Army Chaplain Father Corby admired Meagher for his dedication to his men and to his Catholic faith. While the general did drink heavily on occasion, Father Corby defended him after the general's horse was shot out from under him. Twice. And he landed on his head. Twice. He was accused of drunkenness, but no one ever reported seeing him drink. He likely had concussion, which exhibits the same symptoms. Father Corby said by no means was he a drunkard, passing it off with one of the pet terms of the day for whiskey, "Oh, be joyful." Who hit John? The Widowmaker. Father Corby later became a president of Notre Dame University. Your deeds will live, old red shirts and the boys that wore the green. Daly, no relation to Marcus Daly, was Meagher's ardent champion during the war, but she suddenly became his harshest critic overnight. Aided by newspaperman Thomas Dimsdale, a Southern supporter, Dimsdale was more than happy to disparage Meagher at any opportunity in print and in person. It was later discovered that Mrs. Daly's husband had her eye on a Senate seat, and she feared that Meagher's popularity might jeopardize her own husband's chances. Dimsdale would continue his anti-Meagher campaign for the rest of his life, even including Elizabeth Meagher in his personal attacks. Now, Lincoln may have liked Meagher. Sherman thought him an embarrassment. But the Irishmen especially loved Libby Meagher, who often joined her husband on the battlefield, ministering to the dead and dying of the Irish Brigade, now known as Mrs. Meagher's Own. She kept in contact with a number of her boys for the rest of their life, even sending some of their children to college. The Irish Brigade, under its green banner with a gold harp, fought in all the early battles of the Civil War, each man with a little sprig of green in his cap to identify him as a proud Irishman. Robert E. Lee's own troops applauded Meagher's efforts, and it was Lee himself who christened them the Fighting 69th. Saddened by the killing and needing to recoup from several battlefield injuries, Thomas complained, "Irish-born citizens are fiercely indignant at their treatment by the U.S. Senate." He resigned in frustration and anger in May of 1863, but was reinstated the following year. When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies say we'll all turn out and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Our Civil War ended April 9th, 1865, with Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox. 5 days later, President Lincoln was assassinated. Among the honorary pallbearers at his funeral stood Thomas Francis Meagher. And we'll all feel gay when Lincoln may have liked Meagher. Grant was indifferent. Sherman wanted him out of Washington, far out. And he convinced President Andrew Johnson to appoint Meagher as secretary to the newly formed Montana Territory. And we all know that there's no place further from civilization than Montana. He joined a Minnesota wagon train westbound from Red River Valley country, going overland, then by river, and finally stagecoach to the territorial capital at Bannock. From this valley they say you are leaving. I will miss your bright eyes and sweet smile, but remember the Red River Valley that brightens our pathway a while. His loving wife Elizabeth would arrive in Montana the following year. Come and sit by my side if you love me. Do not hasten to bid me adieu, but remember the Red River Valley and the one who has loved you so true. Now we all know that Montana's first governor was Sidney Edgerton. When Thomas Meagher arrived in September of 1865 in Bannock, Edgerton clapped him on the shoulder, welcomed him to town, handed over the official papers, got on the same stagecoach the same afternoon, and left to go back east. Well, it gets cold out here. And he never came back. So for all intents and purposes, Meagher was now the acting governor of Montana Territory. The capital was shortly thereafter moved to Virginia City, and the governor's mansion was a one-room log cabin, and a replica still stands on the same spot 2 blocks off Main Street in Virginia City. It was going to be a tough go, but Meagher was no quitter. President Johnson had charged him with bringing the territory to statehood, and that's exactly what he intended to do. He told a welcoming party that he could not be yoked, broken, coaxed, or tamed to any party. My party is the people of the United States. That's pretty good, huh? Now, well, of course, he was immediately opposed by the rich and powerful. You see, Montana was heavily populated by Southern Democrats, and Meagher, a Union hero, was immediately disliked by the disenfranchised Confederates. Meagher of the Sword was suddenly being referred to derisively as the acting one. Still, the common people liked him, especially the thousands of Irish immigrants flocking to Montana to work the mines. You brave Irish heroes, where'er you may be, pray stand for a moment and listen to me. Your sons and fair daughters are going away, and thousands are sailing to America. The Montana Territory at this time boasted a non-Indian population of 30,000. Yes, it was getting pretty crowded in Montana Territory. Meagher saw Montana as a place for Irish immigrants to build a strong Irish colony and propel himself to a possible seat in the U.S. Senate. It is my heart's desire to be champion of the Irish race in the wild, great mountains. So good luck to those people, and safe may they land. They're leaving their country for a far distant strand. They're leaving old Ireland no longer to stay, and thousands are sailing to America. As governor, Thomas was also superintendent of Indian Affairs. He felt the Indians were not represented fairly, and he criticized government treaty policies. Repression, imposed religion, starvation. He saw the Indians in the same light as Irish famine victims in his homeland 20 years earlier. Rebellion against oppression must have also resonated strongly with him. So he went to Browning that year, 1865, in the winter in late October, to oversee a treaty with the Blackfeet. Bad weather followed. Now it's 165 miles one way from Virginia City to Browning. It's about 2.5 hours these days. I can make it in 2. Of course, the bad weather followed them. They were lost twice and nearly perished. As he wrote in his journal, the snow, in a word, had it all its own way. The treaty was to go overland by courier to San Francisco, to catch a boat to go down the coast to Panama, across the isthmus by train, catch another boat up the coast to the Atlantic to Washington, where it was to be delivered by a special U.S. Senate courier to Congress to be ratified. But the original courier died before reaching San Francisco, and the treaty disappeared. So Thomas also appointed Peter Ronan as superintendent of public instruction and vetoed a public compensation proposal because he felt the superintendent's salary at $500 a year was too low, saying that education is one of the most important duties we are called upon to perform. That's pretty good too, huh? And at this time, he lobbied the Catholic Archdiocese to appoint a bishop to Montana. And the Indians asked for Father de Smet. And when Elizabeth rowed the riverboat up in 1866, Father de Smet was on board, his 4th of 7 trips up the river. The Meaghers then visited Father Ravalli in Stevensville and went on to St. Ignatius, the mission up there, where he named the 2 highest peaks the Twin Sisters and christened the 4,000-foot waterfall Elizabeth, claiming to be the first white man to see it. That's in my backyard. However, it is also a fact that his drinking was becoming a burden. Someone did not get the memo. I love fare thee well, Oxford told a laddie, oh, there's whiskey in the jar. Hey, whiskey from the devil, you're leading me astray, over hills and mountains and to America. You're sweeter, stronger, dacider, you're spunkier than tay. Oh, whiskey, you're me darling drunker sober. Oh, whiskey, you're me darling drunker sober. By early 1867, Meagher began receiving death threats from the vigilantes. His rudimentary legislature had angered the profiteers out to make a buck on the new territory. Rumors flew in the state's most powerful newspaper, run by his most venomous detractor, Thomas Dimsdale, who had followed him to Virginia City to start the territory's first newspaper. He was rankled as his appointment as superintendent of education was suddenly terminated by Thomas Meagher, who quite frankly remarked, "You haven't done nothing." Rumors flew that Thomas Meagher was a drunk and incompetent. To complicate things, vigilante justice was now being turned against the Indians. They manufactured an Indian scare down in the Gallatin Valley around Bozeman to convince General Sherman to arm a Montana militia. A later investigation found out that there were no whites killed around Bozeman by the Indians at that time, except for one, John Bozeman himself, and those who knew him personally said that he provoked the fight. And yet, Sherman, determined to end the Indian problem, quickly and decisively agreed, and he commissioned General Thomas Meagher to receive a shipment of 2,500 rifles at the farthest inland port at that time, Fort Benton. On the 60-mile trip from Fort Shaw to Fort Benton in summer's heat, Meagher embarked on his final mission. His entire party of 10 was dehydrated and ill with summer sickness. Diarrhea. No. Now we all know summer's heat, right, in Montana. We know horseback riding. We know summer sickness. By the time Meagher left Fort Shaw for Fort Benton, he had been in the saddle for 42 days. Oh, dear God. With illness and threats on his life, friends had him spend the night aboard a riverboat in Fort Benton, and he asked throughout the night, "Why do the vigilantes want me dead? I only tried to be fair to all." Well, that night, July 1st, 1867, Thomas Francis Meagher disappeared. Rumors spread that he was drunk, fell overboard, and drowned in the Missouri River high and fast with runoff. But those who knew him, although no one came forth to say otherwise, debunked the theory. Thomas Meagher was a medal-winning swimmer. His wife Elizabeth rushed to Fort Benton from Helena, and she searched the riverbanks for 2 months. His body was never found. He had lived the equivalent of 2 lifetimes, 7 weeks before his 44th birthday. We shall meet, but we shall miss him. There will be one vacant chair. We shall linger to caress him while we breathe When a year ago we gathered, joy was in his mild blue eye. But a golden cord is severed, and our hopes in ruin lie. Circumstances surrounding Thomas Marr's death have been conflicting ever since. Remember, there was no CNN, no Fox News, no mass media of any kind. We shall meet, but we shall miss him. There will be one vacant chair. We shall linger to caress him while we breathe our evening prayer. While we breathe our evening prayer. What we do know is that he was sick, threatened, broke, and despondent. Now, he had already been relieved of his governing position. His replacement was already in Montana. He had made an offer on some property outside Bozeman and planned to head west to the gold fields and try his hand before going to join the Irish community in San Francisco to seek a possible U.S. Senate seat. He was asked to stay aboard the Thompson by Johnny Duran, who had piloted the same boat that brought his wife Elizabeth the year before. His clothes were found in his room, and his nightshirt with him were gone. There was neither blood nor signs of a struggle, and there are no fewer than 10 theories surrounding his disappearance. One says he was sick, disoriented, the railing was broken outside his cabin, he fell. He was shot by hostile Indians. Doubtful, the Indians liked him. There was a woman. Isn't there always? And she was waiting on the far bank, and he jumped overboard, swam across the river, joined her, and they went to Canada. Now, really. Wouldn't there be an easier way? He was killed by the Klan for his support of Northern policies. He was killed by disgruntled Indian agents. He had caught a couple of them stealing supplies meant for the Indians and using them and selling them themselves. One fellow said later that he was there that night and saw him jump, that he was broke and despondent. And again, those who knew him didn't buy it. He had plans. One theory says that there was a government cover-up. Imagine. There was never an official inquest into the disappearance, mysterious disappearance of a high-ranking federal official. Another theory states that he was killed by British agents who were still sore about his escape from Tasmania. Now this leads to another thing I'll get to in a minute. Another theory was confessed in 1913 in Missoula, where a man on his deathbed confessed that he had been hired by the vigilantes and paid, some say 4,000, some say 8,000, depends on the reporter, to shoot Marr and shove him overboard. But when the fella got better, he recanted his story because they were going to arrest him. And complicating everything, most accounts were written by his bitter enemy, Wilbur Sanders. Now, Sanders was the chief prosecutor of the vigilantes, known for taking the law into their own hands. He had already issued a letter of quietus against the acting one, essentially saying that Marr has lived long enough. Thomas Marr just disappeared. Or did he? In 1899, a prospector 6 miles below Fort Benton found a desiccated corpse, 5 foot 9.5 tall, dressed in the remains of a nightshirt, no ID, with a hole in its forehead. Now this gave rise to the British theory A bullet between the eyes was the accepted execution method of British agents at that time. 1867 also sported the Fenian uprising back east. Now, the Fenians was a radical Irish organization that had recruited Meagher when he lived in New York. Meagher refused to be an active member because they were too radical, and I guess he just didn't want to go through all of that again. Well, the Fenians had a plan to invade Canada, which was a British holding at that time, and hold Canada for ransom until Ireland was freed. And so, of course, if you were a paranoid British agent, you might think that 2,500 rifles going to Thomas Meagher, a known Fenian in Fort Benton, Montana, might bring the Fenians in the back door. Just the theory. The body was sold to an Arthur Miles,